What started with Aaron Glenn has been pushed to the side, and then there was a couple of other names that the Saints dipped their toe in with Mike Kafka, went down to Anthony Weaver in Miami, and then Joe Brady was very much rumored to be in the mix, and he said no, and Mike McCarthy became available, and there's some talk about whether or not that's viable, and the thoughts are that there's not a great start with that first interview, but there may be a second one, and now all of a sudden it feels like Kellen Moore's name is really rising toward the top of this New Orleans Saints coaching search. And so I felt like it was probably about time, since the Saints flew across the country to interview this guy in person, to discuss whether or not that would be a good decision. Kellen Moore is not a guy that I've spent a lot of time talking about on this show. He's kind of a new name to the mix, but he's very much in the same vein as Joe Brady, as a young, offensive-minded, quarterback-driven coach who has had some success calling plays in the NFL, specifically this year. Both guys had offenses in their respective conferences championship games. Kellen Moore's now got one in the Super Bowl. So what is the profile on Kellen Moore? Y'all know his background as a player, and that really is rooted in his immense success at Boise State, where he won more games than anybody in the history of college football. He broke Colt McCoy's record for wins there at Boise State. And he bounced around the NFL for a good amount of time for a fairly undersized quarterback with not a very strong arm and not a very good athlete. But he did hang around a while, and there's good reason for that. It's because he's a football guy. And if it wasn't indicated in his playing career that lasted probably longer than his skill set indicated it should have, it should speak volumes that he literally came off the sidelines with the helmet and shoulder pads on, put them on the ground, picked up a headset, and was immediately hired. He went from backup quarterback in Dallas to quarterback coach in Dallas. Literally went from facing the coach in the room with the quarterbacks to going to the front and facing the quarterbacks as the coach. That's how quickly that turnaround happened for Kellen Moore in Dallas. And he was put in charge early on. In 2020, which you're going back now 5 years of Kellen Moore calling plays, the Cowboys were a 6-10 football team that was not in the top 10 in any relevant offensive statistic. But I'm going to give Kellen Moore a pass for that season because Dak Prescott started 5 games, and then Andy Dalton started 9 games, and Garrett Gilbert started a game, and Ben DiNucci started a game. So you didn't finish in the top 10 in anything in 2020, but it was a weird season with all the COVID stuff, and you had injuries, and you started 4 different quarterbacks, 2 of which are not NFL quality quarterbacks. I don't really care what Kellen Moore did in 2020. But since then, it's been a really nice run of calling offenses for Kellen Moore. He was the play caller in 2021 for a 12-5 Dallas Cowboy football team. They had Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb and Zeke Elliott and Tony Pollard, and Amari Cooper was still on that team. They finished first in the NFL in touchdowns scored that year. They were 7th in the NFL in yards per carry rushing, which is very, very good. They were 3rd in the NFL in passing yards and 5th in the NFL in yards per attempt. That's a superb offense. More touchdowns than anybody in the league, won 12 games. That's really good work there from Kellen Moore. The next year in 2022, you had CeeDee Lamb and Tony Pollard and Zeke Elliott. Dalton Schultz emerged there as a tight end. You had to start Cooper Rush in 5 games that year when Dak Prescott went down. Dak was your starter, but Cooper Rush did play in 5 games. Still, the Cowboys, with a backup quarterback playing for a third of the season, were 3rd in the NFL in touchdowns, 8th in rushing yards. They had a good offense and won 12 football games. I would consider that a solid effort. Then they moved on from Kellen Moore, and Mike McCarthy assumed the play calling duties in Dallas, and he moved on to the Los Angeles, as it were, Chargers. I don't think that'll ever come out of my brain, but that's okay. He went on to the Chargers, and it did not go well. They had Justin Herbert, Austin Eckler, Keenan Allen, Quentin Johnson. They were 5-12. They were 25th in the NFL in touchdowns scored. They were 27th in yards per carry rushing. They did finish 9th in the NFL in passing, but only 21st in yards per attempt. Bad team. Played from behind a lot. Didn't produce as much on offense as probably the skill players would indicate you should have. That was not a great year for offense in LA. One reason or another, it just wasn't. So he moves on from there as Jim Harbaugh comes over to coach the Chargers, and he goes to Philly. And in Philly, this year, they're obviously in the Super Bowl. You're talking about a team you understand with Jalen Hurts and Saquon Barkley and A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. That's a really, really talented group. 7th in the NFL in touchdowns this year. They were 2nd in the NFL in rushing behind the best back in the league this year. 7th in yards per attempt passing the ball with Jalen Hurts. That's a good offense. They did a good job this year. So as I look back over the last 5 seasons, I would suggest that one of them was basically a wash in 2020 because you had ridiculous injuries in quarterback situations. I don't know how anyone could have reasonably held that together. But you look at the other 4, and 3 were really good, and 1 was not good. It's a pretty good run. And I would say this. Look at the quarterbacks he's won with. He's won with Dak Prescott. He's won with Cooper Rush. He's won with Jalen Hurts. Those are very different players. You had very much run-heavy offense with this Steelers group. With Dak, you're throwing it a little bit more. You had CeeDee Lamb on the outside. Now, look, Tony Pollard was a good player, and Zeke was on kind of the end there, but you had really good players on the outside with CeeDee Lamb and Dalton Schultz and Amari Cooper, and that's a different model than what you would have had in other stops. So I feel like there's a little bit of, better phrase this way. It's not like he's hitched his wagon to one guy and one coach, and that's the only way he can be successful. It's kind of the Eric Bieniemy argument, right? Like, okay, yeah, he did a good job with Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes. What'd you do elsewhere? Didn't do well in Washington, didn't do well at UCLA. Like, he hitched his wagon successfully to one guy. You could make that argument for Joe Brady right now. Well, he's doing well with Josh Allen. How'd that work in Carolina? With Kellen Moore, at least it's a couple different stops, a couple different quarterbacks, different circumstances, and solid results in 3 of the 4. I think from an X's and O perspective, from a play calling perspective, from an offensive innovation perspective, Kellen Moore's done a good job. That's really all I can vouch for. I don't know what kind of staff he could put together. I don't know how he would handle in-game stuff as a head coach. I don't know how he would run an organization as far as culture goes, as far as day-to-day stuff goes. I don't know how he is relating to players in the locker room. All that stuff is kind of beyond me. You would have to do a lot of asking around as the Saints brass as far as talking to people that he's worked with in the league. Thankfully, you don't have to make one location's worth of calls. You can call Dallas. You can call the Chargers. You can certainly call Philly. And there are going to be different people that have worked different places as far as players, player personnel. Like there are different references you can have here. And I can't, with any degree of confidence, speak to how Kellen Moore checks those boxes. He's young. He's run a good offense. I think that it is a feather in his cap that he immediately went from a player to a coach within the same organization. That tells me how much respect he had garnered from that group. And I think that there are some real positives there of the stuff that I can measure objectively. I simply don't know the other stuff. He did play for a while. That gives you a reasonable indication that he can relate to the player, having played a lot. But that's not always the biggest deal. All the players loved Sean Payton. It's not like he had a long, illustrious NFL career. So you never really know that until you know. I feel comfortable and confident saying Mike McCarthy knows how to come in, assemble a staff, and run a program. You know that. You don't know that with Kellen Moore. It's impossible to know. But I do like some of the characteristics of his resume this early on. And if you're the Saints and you're going floor versus ceiling here, which is a discussion we've had a ton, if you're going floor versus ceiling, the floor is really low here, but the ceiling could be exceptionally high. I think the floor is pretty high with Mike McCarthy. I don't know what the ceiling is after this many years of not really making a jump. But those are two very different discussions. And the Saints organization is in a very different place than the Dallas organization and the Philly organization. It's its own entity. And it's a hire that I'm certainly not here to criticize if they make it. Actually, I think I would probably be okay with it. but it is one that carries a substantial amount of risk if the Saints want to go in that direction. We'll continue to monitor this. I still feel like by the end of the day Friday, the Saints are going to have a head coach. I don't know that it's going to be Kellen Moore, but I feel like there's a real possibility of that. They can't officially announce him this week. They would have to wait till after the Super Bowl for that. But you could get a report that, according to sources, that such and such has learned that the Saints are finalizing an agreement to land Kellen Moore as the franchise's next head coach. And you wouldn't get any tweets from the Saints but you would understand that that's kind of where things rested. We haven't gotten there yet. It's early in the week, and the Saints brass has a lot to deal with at this point. I know that the Saints are a punching bag for a lot right now. I made my case clear yesterday. I'm not in that mode right now of just absolutely hammering the Saints. Let's see the results of this thing. If it's Kellen Moore, we'll discuss that. I think there's reason to think that's a reasonable idea. Hey, it's on. Thanks for watching Hunt on Saints. Before you leave, help us out a little bit. Hit that like button, leave your comments in the section below, and hit that subscribe button so you get all our content right here from Hunt on Saints. We'll see you next time.